Yeah. No, I'm not always the best one. It was the first thought. We had some of those well attended. You can form your own thing.
I don't know. No, because there's a huge out.
Oh, yes, so they don't need it. Yes, perfect. That'd be great, yeah. Yes, because it's a little.
Bueno, pues podemos empezar. I think we can begin. Thanks everyone for coming, and some people here and some on Zoom. I'm very happy to introduce Sean Kelsey from the University of Notre Dame, who has accepted our invitation to come, and it's wonderful that we have him here. And he's going to talk about mind and world in Aristotle, the Anima. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's a wonderful to be here, and especially to be here in person. Okay, so if it's okay, I'll read my talk, and I have a handout that I'll refer to. On one sheet is kind of a rough outline, and then some passages that I'll talk about. Okay, so the material I want to talk about today is taken from a larger project on the Aristotle's De Anima. And the basic idea of that project is to try to read the De Anima through the lens of a rather particular question. And that question, roughly put, is what is it about the mind that makes it such as to know the world? I mean, to perceive and to understand the truth about reality. And my thought is that first, the question is Aristotle's, and second, that the nub of his answer to it is that in a way, mind is world. In his language, soul, in a way, is all beings. Now today in the talk, I actually want to focus mainly on the question, as distinct from the answer. What question is it exactly? And is the question Aristotle's question? I mean, is it among the questions that he means to answer in the De Anima? But I also want to say at least something about the answer as encapsulated, or so I think, in the remark that, again, soul in a way is all beings. The remark is certainly cryptic and indeed seemingly un-Aristotelian, inasmuch as it looks tantamount, at least at first blush, to some kind of idealism. And so I want to start by having a look at the remark in context. Okay, so now I move to the first part on the outline, a moral and its upshot. So the remark occurs relatively late in the De Anima, in Book 3, Chapter 8. It's introduced as summing up, as drawing the moral of at least some of what to this point Aristotle has been saying about soul. And this introduction is, I think, important. It's as though Aristotle is telling us, listen up, here comes the punchline. In a way, the soul is the beings, all of them. In suke ta onta pos esti panta. Just as an aside, for me it's very hard to hear this as not kind of contrasting and correcting the view that Aristotle has described in Book 1, Chapter 2, which he attributed to many of his predecessors, whom he represents as saying that soul is the elements of all beings. It's as if you say, no, in a way, it just is the beings. Not just their elements, but all of them. So I did hear this remark against the background of that discussion in 1-2. But in any case, the punchline, soul is all beings, is pretty compressed. And in fact, we do get some elaboration and comment in the lines that immediately follow. Now I'm going to look at passage 1, which I'll read. It's the first passage of it. But now, to put a cap on what we have said about soul, let us say again that soul in a way is all beings. For beings are either perceptible or intelligible, and understanding is its objects in a way, and sensibility its objects. But what way this is needs looking into. Well, understanding and sensibility are divided into the things, potentially, fulfillment and fulfillment. But the sentient and understanding parts of soul are these potentially. In the one case, what is understandable, in the other, what is perceptible. And it is necessary that they be either the things themselves or their forms, surely not the things, for it is not the stone that is in the soul, but rather its form. The result is that the soul is like the hand. Indeed, for the hand is tool of tools, and intelligence form of forms, and sensibility form of sensibility. Okay, so I start with what I hope are 3 easy points about this passage. First, Aristotle's initial wording notwithstanding, in a way, soul is all beings. But it's not, in fact, all soul that he thinks is all beings. No, that honor evidently belongs only to some soul, specifically to the sort that is both sentient and intelligent. And this is clear from the reason he gives for saying that soul is all beings. Namely, that while beings are either perceptible or intelligible, sensibility in a way is the perceptible beings, as understanding, episteme, in a way is the intelligible ones, literally episteta. And since the only soul Aristotle thinks is capable of both perceiving and understanding is our human soul, his point must be that human soul, quote, in a way is all beings. Okay, so on the handout, that's elaboration 1. Second point, the statement that soul is all beings, even when restricted to just human soul, needs further qualification. In a way, Aristotle says, soul is all beings. And the way he means, as he also says, is potentially. That is, it is only when our soul is, so to speak, at work. That is, when we are using our senses, or using our intelligence, when we are perceiving or understanding, that it is, in fulfillment, the beings we are then perceiving or understanding. So that leads us to elaboration 2. Soul in the way that all beings make that potentially all beings. And third, a third qualification is word, when Aristotle says of our human soul that it is potentially all beings, what he actually means, again as he says, is that it is potentially the forms of all beings. For it is not a stone that is in the soul, but rather its form. And that's elaboration 3 on the handout. And if you put those 3 elaborations together, then the moral, as initially stated, it's transformed into a qualified version. Human soul is potentially the forms of all beings. That's easy, I hope. Now, taken together, these 3 points soften the remark that the passage begins with. Everyone knows that for Aristotle, the mind, in knowing the world, is somehow likened to, somehow becomes, the same in form as the being it knows. What seemed provocative about the opening remark, however, that soul in the way is all beings, was its apparent suggestion that soul, in its own nature, and therefore in advance of its use in knowing the world, is already all beings. And it's precisely that suggestion that's retracted by the qualification that soul is but potentially all beings. Okay, so it looks like things are cleaned up. We can breathe a sigh. Or is the suggestion retracted? We have yet to consider the last thing Aristotle says in this passage, his statement of the result, or consequence, or upshot, hosta, of the remark with which he began, now qualified and limited by the points that intervene. The result, or consequence, or upshot, he says, is that the soul is like the hand. Indeed, for the hand is tool of tools, and intelligence, form of forms, and sensibility, form of sensibility. What does that mean? And how is it related to what precedes? Okay, well, we began from the remark that, in a way, the soul is all beings. And we have seen that this remark is to be limited and qualified. It makes the point that our human soul is potentially the forms of all beings. Not only that, but we've also seen why Aristotle thinks this is a fair characterization of our soul. Namely, because our soul is both sentient and intelligent. Owing to its sentient part, what I would call sensibility, isis, our soul is potentially the forms of all perceptible beings. Owing to its scientific part, what I would call intelligence, nous, our soul is potentially the forms of all intelligible beings. So far, so good. But now suppose we were to press a step further and ask, yes, but owing to what are they? Sensibility and intelligence, potentially in between them, the forms of all beings. And perhaps we will be told why each of them owing to its own very self, to its own nature or essence. But though this is no doubt true, in Aristotle's view, still the question remains, or at least seems to remain, yes, but what are those natures? I mean, what is the nature, the essence, the what is it of sensibility? And what is the nature or essence of intelligence? Now, granted, Aristotle does not himself take this further step, does not raise these further, basically Socratic questions about the nature or quiddity of sensibility, isis, and intelligence, nous. Not in this passage. Still, he does raise them and answer them earlier in the De Anima. Sensibility, he says, is, quote, a kind of logos. Specifically, as it were, a kind of meaning of the contrariety perceptible qualities. And intelligence, he says, at least one kind of intelligence, is something simple, separate, unmixed, being in its essence, activity. And what is more, it's pretty plainly these doctrines, the one about the nature of sensibility, the other about the nature of intelligence, that he's here drawing the moral of in our passage from 3.8. He's certainly not drawing the moral of what he said about the first kind of soul, we're back in De Anima 2.4. And that moral, in a word, is that soul, of this human soul, is like the hand. Like the hand, in that sensibility and intelligence, which are what distinguish our soul from all other soul, are the forms of the respective objects. In the one case, perceptible forms, in the other, intelligible forms. Now, if we fit that moral to our further questions about the essence or quiddity, the owing to what is it, so on, the idea would be it's owing to that. It's owing to there being the forms of their objects. That sensibility and intelligence are, again, potentially, between them, the forms of all beings. Okay, now, stepping back a little bit, but that's it. Whatever else we make of this passage, the bit of the passage I've labeled the upshot, it certainly does suggest that Aristotle thinks of sensibility and of intelligence as being in their own natures, that is, in advance of their use in knowing anything, forms. Indeed, not just any forms, but special forms. Forms that are special, that is, in their relationship or standing vis-a-vis other forms. All other forms. They are the form of other forms. And although the exact nature and consequences of this special standing are hardly to be extracted from this passage alone, right? So I'll try to be a little cautious with the passage. Still, the passage is suggestive, and it's especially suggestive when read against the background of the question that I want to press. Roughly put, why is it in our nature to know being? If that question were Aristotle's question too, if he thought the answer was lie in the nature of our cognitive powers, of sensibility and intelligence, if the point of the remark we began from is to draw the moral of his account of the natures of those powers, in that case, the result would be that for Aristotle, the reason it lies in our nature to know beings is that our cognitive powers, sensibility and intelligence, in their very own nature, and therefore antecedently to their use in knowing anything, are forms of the forms of all beings. And in any case, it's this doctrine that the larger project, in a way, is about trying to understand, on the hypothesis that it's intended to encapsulate Aristotle's answer to the question that I want to press. But now I'm going to let that sit. For the rest of the talk, I want to take a step back and focus actually on the question. I want to be a little clearer about what the question is, and also about that it's Aristotle's question, because a lot of what I extract or would like to extract from this passage depends on fitting it against the background of this question, so that needs to be kind of in place. Okay. So I want in part to clarify the question, and in part to make plausible that it's Aristotle's question. So first, and now I'm on the second part two, called clarifying the question. And consider generally the question that I'm interested in, that I want to press, I think is Aristotle's question. It seeks the cause of a fact. In the lingo, it seeks the why, the dihoti, of a that, a hot. In a headline, of the fact that mind knows world. And for starters, by way of clarifying the question, we might ask, well, what fact is this? Mind knows world. In Aristotle's language, soul knows beings. Soul knows all the beings. It's characteristic of animals in different ways and to different degrees to be sensitive to opportunities afforded by their environments. In Aristotle's language, to make discriminations, and perceive, astonishment. For example, predators and prey, obstacles and path, offsprings and mates, and so on. And if all that, then also things like size and shape and motion and rest. And if all that, then also one or more of, say, temperature, hardness, moisture, savor, odor, color, pitch. In Aristotle's view, there's no question but that this is characteristic of animals, That is a fact of life, on a par with the fact of nature that some beings move. And as such, it's both a starting point for inquiry and matter for explanation. Another fact of life, similar but different, concerns human beings. It's in our nature to pick up what's on offer, not merely in our immediate environment, in the way of just getting by, but in the whole wide world, in the way of understanding or insight. It's true that, for Aristotle, it's not every being that is, so to speak, on principle, and also that, absent a principle, there is, in a way, nothing to get. Some things are done on impulse, not on policy. Some are due to luck, not to skill. Some are due to chance, not to nature. Of such matters, at least in a way, there is no why, no scope for understanding or insight. But none of this upsets the larger point, which is not only that, by and large, there is a what and a why to what we do and what there is, but also that it lies in our nature both to seek and to find it. In short, understanding why is a function, an ergon, or fulfillment, entelecheia, of our nature as intelligent creatures. In Aristotle's view, this too is a fact of life, and thus a starting point for inquiry and matter for explanation. Okay, so for a start, it's these big, broad, basic facts of life about animals in general and about human beings in particular that the question I think Aristotle is asking is about. Taken together and in a headline, the fact that mind knows world. And the reason I take them together is that Aristotle himself often does the same, treating them as one big fact. And he too states that fact in a headline, roughly and schematically, by attributing knowledge, togenosking, to soul. And now the exact formulation varies. Sometimes he flat out predicates knowledge of soul. That's when he says, for example, that the soul both knows and understands or judges. Sometimes he uses a construction with a genitive of characteristic, saying that knowledge or perception is of soul. Other times he says that knowing belongs to soul by nature, hyparche katafusin. Other times he speaks of perceiving or understanding as among the attributes, affections, functions of soul. Pate, sudavekota, pathemata, erga. Okay, in passages 2 to 4 we find some of these uses. Now, I regard these formulations as just variations of a kind of shorthand. They serve to indicate, roughly and in general, what Aristotle regards as simply a fact, namely that it is in the very nature of living things, at least some living things, to perceive or to understand, or to perceive and understand beings, all beings. And the question I think he's asking seeks the cause of this fact. In brief and in shorthand, why does it belong naturally, to soul, to know beings? Okay. Subjects and attributes. Now, I suppose that Aristotle's use of this shorthand raises a question. What sense, if any, does it make to attribute knowing, or for that matter, any vital activity, to soul in particular, as opposed to creatures that have soul, that is, living things? Taken on its face, to say that some vital activity belongs to soul appears to imply that soul itself is what does, or undergoes, or performs that activity. For example, that soul itself is what grows, or perceives, or moves, or understands. And most commentators, self-included, find it difficult to believe that this is Aristotle's view. Namely, that though much, or perhaps all, vital activity is also attributable to living things, ta empsuka, being a joint undertaking of both living things themselves and the soul that is in them, still, even such vital activity as is attributable to living things also is in the first instance performed or undergone or executed by soul itself. For some reason, I have a reference here to passage 3, which I might as well read. It's like the mission statement of the Anima. It's a mission statement of something. Whether it's a mission statement of the Anima or if it's a mission statement of a larger project in which the Anima is just the beginning is an open question. We are seeking to contemplate and to discover its nature and substance, its nature and essence. Then all its attributes, some of which are held to be proprietary affections of soul, others to belong, because of it, to animals too. Such a view invites us to conceive of soul as being, if not literally a body, still some body-like item that, having taken hold of other bodies, possessed them as it were, and thereby made them living things, then utilizes those bodies in performing its own work. But this conception is excluded, I think, by Aristotle's definition of soul, according to which soul is not a body, being rather the form and fulfillment of certain kinds of body. And it's true that Aristotle often predicates vital activities of soul or of its powers. Nonetheless, in one place, he also explicitly corrects this, remarking that it's probably better not to say that the soul pities or learns or reasons, but that the human being does with his soul. And that's passage 5, maybe. Yeah, passage 5. And indeed, he elsewhere speaks in similar terms about art. In some places saying that it does or make things, in others that human beings do so with it. But surely Aristotle does not think art is a body-like item which first occupies and then uses human beings to perform its own work. And so I think we'll have to go this way. There are other things to say. Now, these considerations make it tempting to suggest that when Aristotle speaks of vital activities as belonging to soul, this is by a kind of metonymy, and that what these activities really belong to is living things. But there's reason to resist this suggestion, and I'm not going to resist it. I think it's important to resist it. And first, it's hard to square with the idea that perhaps some vital activity is proprietary to soul. That is, does not also belong because of soul to animals too. Passage 3 at the minimum opens the possibility of that. Doesn't go so far as to assert that that possibility is realized, but observes that there are some that are at least held to be of that character. But you might think, well, that's a very special case, and hard cases make bad law, and in general, it's as I suggested. But there's a related and I think more important point, and I'm still thinking about passage 3. To say of some attribute that it belongs to living things because of soul, dia plus a few zero, is to say of that attribute that its connection to soul is somehow prior to and explanatory of its connection to living things. Indeed, just this is also implied by Aristotle's own definition of soul as the substance, form, and fulfillment of natural organic bodies. For one upshot of that definition, Aristotle makes this point himself, is that soul is the essence of living things, which implies that it is somehow the cause of their attributes. That is, the reason why those attributes belong to them. But in that case, it can hardly be a figure of speech when Aristotle says, speaks, say, of knowledge or the imparting of motion as belonging to soul itself. For his own account of the nature of soul as the essence of living things implies that the connection of these attributes to soul is prior to and explanatory of their connection to living things. You lose the explanation if the explanans is just a figure of speech for the explanand. That's the and it seems to me Aristotle takes the explanatory thing seriously. It seems to me passage 3 in a way sets it up. First, its nature of Lucia, then its attributes. And then one will explain the other good Socratic procedure. In view of these considerations, I would suggest that the sense in which these vital activities belong to soul is actually simply the sense in which any activity belongs to that of which it is an operation, an area, or employment or use, phrases. Here I'm looking at a bit passages 6 and 7, in which we find Zoe, spoken of as crasis and energia, and where we find it, Zoe also called it energia specifically of soul. That's passage 7. It's true that this way of talking makes it look as though soul is a power or dunamis, and that Aristotle does not define soul as a dunamis, but rather as a kind of fulfillment, specifically the first fulfillment of certain kinds of life. But although this is important, I don't see that it's a difficulty. In Aristotle's view, power and fulfillment are both said in many ways, and if soul is the first fulfillment of certain kinds of body, it is likewise a power for Zoe, for what I'll call vital activity, living. My suggestion then is that for Aristotle, Zoe belongs to soul, not in the sense of being performed by soul, hupo, but in the sense of being an operation of soul. That is one of its natural functions, uses. And I want to illustrate that a little bit. So just as seeing is a use of the sense of sight, and healing is a use of the art of medicine, and deliberation and decision are uses of phronesis, and contemplation, teaching, and proof are uses of episteme, so too, I suggest, perception, understanding, nutrition, growth, reproduction, and so on, are all of them uses or operations, energiae, of soul. And as just as the former doctrines hardly invite us to conceive of the sense of sight, or the art of medicine, or phronesis, or episteme, as though they were body-like operators, neither does the latter invite us to conceive of soul in that way. Moreover, although, for example, healing the sick belongs not only to the art of medicine, but also to physicians, the reason why it belongs to physicians, the reason why it is their work, is that it belongs to, is the natural employment of, their art, the art of medicine. That is, healing is not an employment of the art of medicine because it's a work of physicians, and whatever is their work is therefore, for that reason, an employment of it. Rather, it's the other way around. Healing is a work of physicians because it's an employment of their art, the art of medicine. That's why it's reasonable to demand the physician to do their job. Well, why is it their job? It's because it's their profession, it's their art. Similarly, although much, perhaps all vital activity belongs also to living things, the reason it belongs to living things is that it's an operation of soul. That is, vital activity is not an operation of soul because it's the work of living things, and whatever is the work of living things is therefore, for that reason, an operation of soul. Rather, it's the other way around. Vital activity is the work of living things because it's the operation of soul. And operations of soul are the work of living things. On the current proposal, then, it comes out that just as healing's connection to the art of medicine is prior to and explanatory of its connection to physicians, so too the connection of vital activity to soul is prior to and explanatory of its connection to living things. So that's my second clarification. Explanation in essence. So far I've tried to clarify actually the fact that the question I think Aristotle is asking is a question about the headline, the fact that mind is world, in Aristotle's language, the fact that knowledge is an attribute of, or belongs to, soul. If not all soul, then to such soul as is sentient and intelligent. So, leaving the fact aside, I now want to say a bit more about the question. I think Aristotle is asking about that fact. Why? Considered in terms of its form, the question asks why, diete, some attribute, belongs to some subject. But this may be put a little more precisely. What the question is asking in particular is, what about that subject, soul, makes it a subject of that attribute, knowledge? In Aristotle's language, the question is, by being what? Tit on, or dia ta tit ani. Does it belong to soul to know beings? Now, the point may be illustrated from criticism Aristotle makes of some of his predecessors. Okay, I'll be looking here at passages 8 and 9, I think. These thinkers, he says, arrived at their views about the nature of soul from looking to the fact that it is of soul to know beings. That's in passage 8. What must soul be, they wondered, if knowledge of beings is to belong to it by nature? A kind of amalgam, they concluded, of the elements of beings. For, they held, knowledge is of like by like. And in that case, they reasoned, if it belongs to soul to know beings, soul must be like beings, which is just what it would be if it were an amalgam of all the same ingredients, namely the elements or principles of beings. All the elements or principles of all beings. And the result is a view about what soul is, about its nature or essence. But it's not merely a view about that nature or essence, as Aristotle represents it. It's a view about that which also purports to show why it belongs to soul to know beings. The idea is that it belongs to soul to know beings because soul is like beings, like them in being an amalgam of all the same elements. Now, one criticism Aristotle makes of this view is that it fails to explain the fact it sets out to explain. It does not, he says, belong to soul to know beings because soul is an amalgam of elements. That's passage 9. This is an important passage for me. So I'll read it. He said, it's clear this is a kind of summing up in the Anima 1.5, or the criticisms he's been making of large families of theories about the nature of soul. He says, it's clear then from what has been said that knowledge does not belong to soul because of its being an amalgam of elements, so to speak. Even granted that soul is an amalgam of elements, that's not why knowledge belongs to it. Nor is it well that is truly said that it, i.e. soul, is in motion. What is more, it seems to me that in making this criticism, his predecessors, Aristotle is inviting us to ask him in turn. All right then, why don't you tell us? By being what does it belong to soul to know beings? Right? I mean, he doesn't fault them for asking the question. He faults them for failing to answer. And in faulting them for failing to answer the question, it seems to me he makes himself vulnerable, liable, open. Well, what is the answer? These guys didn't have it right. What do you say? I'm all ears. Okay? And I read this passage as setting expectations, so to speak, of the slot into which to fit the answers Aristotle's going to give about soul and its powers and their natures, and in a way setting the bar that they must clear in order to be good answers by Aristotle's own ways. That's the only. Now, it's true that, as formulated here, the question presupposes things that Aristotle rejects. This is true. For example, that it does belong to soul, that is, to all soul, to no beings. He doesn't think so. Or that all soul is uniform, homoeis, that is, one and the same in every living creature, like in Frankenstein. But even once these points and some others are acknowledged, the broad fact from which we began remains basically intact. That is, it does belong to soul, not all soul, but some soul, to know, that is, to perceive and to understand, perceptible and intelligible beings, that is, all beings. And if the fact remains, the question remains too, by being what, does it belong to that kind of soul to do that? And so, we're looking for an account of the essence of that kind of soul. particular, the essence of what differentiates it from other kinds of soul, isis and nous, which will explain why the attributes which belong to it belong to it. Okay, that's the kind of why. Not looking for the efficient cause and mechanisms, but we're looking for an account of the essence of the subject, which explains why the attributes which belong to that subject belong to that subject. And my idea is that Aristotle's treatment of his predecessors, one of the Anima, creates the expectation that he is going to succeed in the enterprise which he represents them as undertaking but failing. Right? So of course this is all his representation of what they were really, what they were saying amounts to, what motivated it, and so on. And in representing them that way and then criticizing on failing to succeed in those terms, he creates the expectation that he will succeed where nobody else before him has. Now, this brings me to this last point under part 2. Clarifying the question. Okay. The question, I think, as I just had it, by being what does it belong? To particular kinds of soul, no means to perceive. So now, look, in a way, the answer to the question is obvious. The reason it belongs to some soul to no means is that soul of that kind is sentient and intelligent. Voila! So this brings me to my last point, which I think the question is Aristotle's asking is after something more than this. And here I think the point may be illustrated from Aristotle's treatment of another fact, right? Namely the fact that animals move. In shorthand, that it belongs to some soul to impart motion to animals. Here too we might ask, or I think we might ask, by being what does it belong to such soul to do that? What sort of answer would Aristotle give to that question? Now, Aristotle imputes to his predecessors a tolerably substantive answer. Roughly put, that the reason it belongs to soul to impart motion, kine, is that soul itself is something in motion, kinetai. I think this is in passage 2, I don't know that means. Okay. Now, it's true that Aristotle himself rejects this answer. It's impossible, he says, that motion should be even an attribute of soul, let alone any part of what it is in its essence. This is in passages 9 and 10. 9 we've already looked at, and passage 10. Right, and I read passage 9 as saying, so to speak, look, even granted that soul's not an amalgam, that soul is an amalgam of elements, that doesn't explain why it has knowledge from attribute. And I read the second criticism in what we reverse. Even granted that it would explain why soul imports movement to animals, if soul were itself in motion. The fact is, far from being its essence, it's not even true of soul that it's in motion. It's like a category mistake. So one criticism, it's not even true. The other criticism, that it doesn't explain. But again, and this is a point I made earlier in connection with passage 9, although Aristotle rejects the answer, he doesn't reject the question. That is, he himself is not at all content simply to say that the reason it belongs to some soul to impart motion is that soul of that kind is motion imparting, kineticon, or kinyon. On the contrary, the first question he asks, when he begins his own treatment of this topic, is what on earth is the emotion imparting part of the soul? Is it in fact just a part of their soul, or is it the entire thing? And if a part, which part? One already mentioned, or some other one besides? This is passage 11. And I leave aside the details of Aristotle's answers to these questions, which are in any case controversial. The point I'm now making is just that in seeking and asking why it belongs to some soul to impart motion, okay? Aristotle is not content just to say that, oh, well, because that kind of soul is motion imparting. Which would be, if I ask why does it belong to some kind of soul to perceive? I'm told, well, soul sentient. Why does it belong to some kind of soul to understand? Oh, that kind of soul is intelligent, right? These answers are on par. And Aristotle's treatment of the motion answer suggests that he wants more than just this kind of Molierian virtus primitiva explanation. And ditto I submit as regards why it belongs to our human kind of soul to perceive and to understand beings. What is wanted is not simply the information that our soul is the kind that is both sentient and intelligent. What is wanted is an account of what makes our soul sentient and intelligent. If not its being an amalgam of elements, then what? And we could ask the same question about motion and form. If not its being in motion, then what? All ears, Aristotle. It was a good question. I see that the other answers were silly. So what should we think instead? And so that's the idea. Okay. Put slightly differently, what's wanted is an account of sensibility and intelligence themselves. An account of what each of them is, such as will also tell why, that is, by being what, it belongs to them by nature, that is their function or work, to perceive and to understand beings. Okay. I said that this was the last point, but I misspoke. That was the penultimate. This is the last point. Right, their essences are categorical, was the previous point. Right, it's no answer to say that it belongs in our nature to know beings because our nature is neuristic. That's not, he wants more than that. It's no answer, maybe too strong. It's not enough of an answer. This context. This brings me to the last. Okay, so the question I had been focused on asks why an attribute, knowledge, belongs to a subject. So, and it seeks a categorical answer to that question in terms of the nature or essence or TST. What is it of that subject? And I've argued that Aristotle means to provide such an answer in the De Anima. It's not just that he puts the question on his agenda in the beginning of the De Anima, in the kind of mission statement passage. It's also that he takes his predecessors to task, again, not for asking the question, but for failing to answer it. Still, maybe that was a mistake on his part. After all, the question is dizzying in its generality. What could count as a satisfying answer? What would such an answer exclude? What would it secure? So I want to end by saying something that I think about these last questions. And first, consider some analogous questions as raised about analogous facts. For example, why? Why being what? Does it belong, say, to the art of medicine to heal, or to the art of building to build? These are questions about the functions of these arts. They ask why those functions are functions of those arts. And they seek answers in terms of the nature of those arts. Now, I allow that these are questions that, in some moods, Aristotle might refuse, on the ground that the arts in question are simply defined by their functions. This is a passage I wrote for which suggests this. But I also observe that in other moods, he might rise to debate, making appeal to the doctrine that arts are, or what? That arts are the very forms of their products. Arts are the very forms of their products. This doctrine makes a categorical statement, admittedly very general, about what arts are. The generality of the statement precludes it from saying much. Still, it does exclude something. For example, that the association of medicine with health and of building with buildings is merely a coincidence. And it also secures something. For example, that healing and building really do belong to the arts of medicine and building, that they really are functions of those arts. And moreover, there is sometimes a point to securing even this much in contexts in which the going alternatives effectively deny it. And such is the context Aristotle often takes himself to be in. Certainly, it is the perceived context of his investigation of nature. As he complains about Empedocles in Physics 2:8, a person who says that namely, roughly, that this comes from that, as luck would have it, simply, quote, does away with nature, and things due to it altogether. And he speaks actually in a similar vein about earlier views about soul. This is passage 12, complaining that most of them neglect the fact that things interact, not just any old thing with just any old thing, but because of their community, via attained koinonia. And in the case of interest in here, the community of subject and object, of knower and known, of soul and being. Considerations like these are a guide to what we may expect from Aristotle in the way of explaining certain facts of life. For example, the fact that it belongs to our soul to perceive and to understand, taken together and in short, to know beings. We may expect him to try to explain this fact in terms of the nature of soul, not of all soul, but of our soul, and specifically of its cognitive powers, sensibility, and intelligence. In particular, we may expect that his accounts of what those powers are intended precisely to reveal their community with their respective objects, with perceptible and intelligible beings, and thereby to show why the association of those powers with those objects is not merely as luck would have it, but is rather in line with their respective natures. Put another way, we may expect Aristotle's accounts of the natures of those powers, sensibility and intelligence, to be his attempts to say, by being what, it is their work to perceive and to understand perceptible and intelligible beings. And in fact, we know already, more or less, what we will find. The thesis that sensibility is a kind of logos, specifically a kind of mean, and that intelligence is simple, separate, not mixed. And it's these theses that I'm thinking just are Aristotle's attempt to answer my question. To say, by being what, it is of sensibility and intelligence to perceive and to understand beings. Okay? So now I conclude. The basic idea of the project that I've been working on is to try to look at some familiar but obscure doctrines from a somewhat different perspective. The doctrines, as I think, attempt to define sensibility and intelligence, to answer the Socratic question as posed each of them. They say in brief that one is a kind of logos, specifically a kind of mean, the other something simple, separate, and mixed. Actually, at this stage, the details matter. They matter eventually, but they don't matter at this stage. And the new perspective is to see these doctrines as filling out Aristotle's answer to a particular question. Roughly, why? By being what does it belong to us by nature to perceive and to understand beings? And my guiding hypothesis is that Aristotle gives us, so to speak, in a nutshell, the gist, the substances, the upshot of his answer to that question in the dark but suggestive remark from which I began, that soul in a way is all beings. I've suggested that the upshot of this remark, once duly limited and qualified, is that to differentiate the human soul, sensibility, and intelligence are in their very nature, that is, in advance of their use in knowing anything, to explain why it's their use to know things, forms of their respective objects, perceptible and intelligible beings. And for more on what that means, well, so the project is now a book, and you have to read the book. That's what I have for today.
Thanks, Sean, for this wonderful and very inclusive talk. So we now open the session to question and answer. Questions? Yeah.
First, I wanted to ask, what do you think about the opening sentence in physics? Because it seems that to know is the job that we humans do. And now we have an explanation. We need an explanation of why we do that kind of thing, right? And the Anima seems to answer the question. I wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
So I do think it's right to take the opening sentence of the metaphysics as another statement of the sort of fact which I'm reading the Anima as trying to explain. The answer to the question is difficult, so I'm going to point in a second to a passage that guides me in thinking about it. But one reason why, and this is a difference between the days, so in the metaphysics, in that opening chapter, we make these remarks about the different animals and so on, and then we're kind of trying to bring into focus this notion of wisdom as like sort of the complete fulfillment of our intellectual nature. Okay, so in particular, sensibility is left to one side, and not every hexis of our intelligence and its deployment is on the table, but we're kind of taking all men desire to know, and now working from there to get this thing wisdom, which we're then going to try to sharpen and then try to acquire in a way is the term. So the idea of the Anima is quite broad. Yeah, so the animals are not just a stepping stone to move on. And one of the things that happens in the Anima is that sensory knowledge and intellectual knowledge are kind of sharply distinguished in a way that Aristotle represents and is not having been distinguished by his predecessors. This surfaces in De Anima 1-2, but it also surfaces in De Anima 3-3, and so on. And so, as a consequence, when I think about my question, why does it belong to our nature to know beings, that question is not going to get kind of single, straightforward, simple answer, because we have to distinguish between these different modalities of knowledge and the different kinds of beings which are their objects, and so on. And there's this important difference between the senses on the one hand and intelligence on the other hand, namely that each of the senses is kind of very specialized in terms of the range of objects, okay? Whereas nous noe panta, it's not specialized. And so the sorts of things that we can say to explain about the senses in general, about each sense in particular, what it is about it explains why it's innate, is going to be quite different than what's going to happen in the intellectual case given these differences. Nonetheless, now on the hand that I look at passage 13, this is from me, also this is from De Anima 1-5, and it's a kind of guiding passage. It doesn't really show anything, but it's a suggestive passage. So he's complaining again here against these souls and amalgam of elements kind of idea. And he said, if we must make soul out of the elements, that is, in order to explain why it belongs to soul and no beings, if we must make soul out of the elements, there's no need to make it from all. One part of a contrariety is enough to judge both itself and its opposite. For by the straight we know both itself and the curved. For the straight edge is judged of both, though the curved is judged neither of itself nor of the straight. Okay, so one of the ideas implicit in the illustration in this passage is this idea of a kind of standard in relationship to which discriminations are made. To judge the straight and the curve accurately, as they are, is to, so to speak, place them in relationship to not just any shape, but to a particular shape, namely the straight, which is in a way a kind of measure of shapes on this spectrum, in as much as all the other shapes, they either are straight or they depart from the straight. And if we ask, what is it about a straight edge that makes it its work to discriminate linear shape? We'll say, well, it has to do with its form or essence, which is located, in its edge, specifically its shape, straight. That actually is the measure of linear shape. And because its form is the measure of linear shape, that's what makes it an instrument for discriminating linear shape. Okay, so I'm using this now as a way to think about as a frame in which to try to interpret what Aristotle will say about sensibility and what he'll say about intelligence. But it's going to have to go quite differently in the two different cases for the reasons that I mentioned. And I'm afraid then there's going to be quite some drift from the passage which you began from the opening line of the. Yeah, so does that explain why I answered the question? Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Ricardo.
Yes, I have two questions, if I may. One has to do with this elaboration 3 of the initial thesis, which is that human, with the pre-elaborations, no? And then the final results that human soul is potentially the forms of all beings. Now, this, I take it, is equivalent to this idea in Aristotle that human soul takes on the sensible form of that which perceives, or it takes on the form, the intelligible form of that which thinks.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. So my first question is how should we understand this the is, no? I mean, or takes on. I mean, what does it mean for the soul to take on the form of, for example, or what does it mean for the soul to take on
passage, this criticism in passage 9, if we take the criticism in what you suggest. And so I suppose my first move would be to think is to not move so quickly to the idea that the moral is there's no material explanation or cognitive. Although in a way, there's a form of that moral, which I think I want to accept. So I think Aristotle thinks that this is suggested, I think, by passage 13 with the straight edge. That the principle of knowledge in some domain is the form, where a form is unlike anything material, and it doesn't move, and it doesn't change. It's a standard. It's a moral. It's, so to speak, in its very idea, it's the kind of thing which doesn't move, change, or and so one way to hear the criticism, right, is instead of looking in the first instance to what soul is made of, we need to identify what form it is. If we're going to explain why it has the cognitive powers. And I'm thinking in particular in the case of the senses, the form he's after is, it's a mean, where the mean has a kind of priority to the other forms in the spectrum. So if we think analogous to how it is, I think how it is in the case of the virtues. If we talk about, for instance, courage, cowardice, recklessness, and notice how we take that arithmetical mean point between, when we're talking about the degrees of fear, daring, right? Not too much, not too little, just right. And we ask, what is, so to speak, the standard? And if the standard is as the courageous person determined. And consequently, what it is to be too reckless or too fearful, too not daring enough, or not fearful enough, is to be more or less fearful in relationship to the mean. So there's the mean has a kind of conceptual to the other positions on the scale, and I associate that in Aristotle with the idea of the mean as a kind of measure. The idea of a measure in general as having a kind of primacy relative to the genes. And so I think that what he wants to do, this will, I think, circle me back now to your first question. But the thing that he wants to get at is we need to identify some form which has the relevant priority to the forms which it is within its purview to perceive. And so that that form is actually the measure of its objects. And I think what Aristotle wants to say is about our senses is that the measure. So if we talk about pitch, for example, what makes a pitch a high pitch or a low pitch? Aristotle associates pitch with the rapidity of movement. Okay? But what makes a movement fast or slow? Right? Is there like a medium which is a pitch which is like perfectly slow, movement that's perfectly slow, or movement that's perfectly fast? It seems to me that this is my idea, right? That actually it's the sense of hearing. There's the normal health of our hearing equipment is in its healthy form. Then the things which are excessive or deficient relative to it are the ones which are fast or slow or hot or cold or hard or soft or wet or dry or so. And that sensibility itself actually is the standard in relationship to which other conditions on the spectrum are defined. Okay, so in a way you get a sort of version of homonym sort of known as the measure of things, except it's going to be the nature of our cognitive powers rather than how things happen to appear to each individual, which is something that's always changing. So, so now when we go back to the question of form reception, right? Taking on or being affected by or being moved by, and how we understand this. And I think there's two things that I want to say about it. Certainly, one thing I want to say about it is that Aristotle seems to use this vocabulary to emphasize some kind of passivity of the knowing subject in relationship to its object, right? Knowing is not a form of poiesis, it's a form of asking. And the idea that what's on the other end of that, that what's received is the form, is now kind of set by, well, it's the form. I mean, it's easier in the perceptual cases. The form imparts, for instance, the color, imparts movement, the environment, which movement reaches the animal. I take it the movement continues through the exterior, the peripheral sense organs, which, like the air, are transparent, but the light can, so the movement can go through, and then the movement reaches the central, so that it's registered or perceived. I think I do want to say that what it is for the animal to now receive the form, for it to be, so to speak, affected by the movement, is for it to perceive. Whether or not that involves other physical movements, whether the specific movement that Surachi has in mind that takes on form that it's perceiving, or some other movements, is not, I think, settled by the the thing that inclines me rather against that. So suppose I had a spring scale, and so I put weight on it, and it descends the spring. How long descends the spring? How long the weight is, as long as it's not too heavy, don't break the machine. An instrument that worked like that would be difficult to take the weight of anything else. Yeah, and because certainly in the visual base here, it seems infinite. And indeed, it seems for Aristotle, this is a problem that he just discusses. I think it's in 2 and also it's at 2.7, and it seems to have this metaphor, which I'm very happy about, somewhat elaborated at a point on which several lines converge. So it's one and the same point, the end point of several lines. So for what it's worth, where I am most inclined to go is to think of these movements as reaching some central point in the interior, but not their descending in any particular way. Well, because to the so in normal operation, that's because if it's distended in a particular way, then it seems to me it's thereby rendered unsuited. So, but I think, strictly speaking, my interpretation can let that kind of sit, because the thing that I want to say that's most vital is to characterize the natural healthy condition of the point reached as a form, and specifically as therefore a metric or standard in relationship to which as far as the mechanisms go, I think that's more particular than at least the expectations that I've tried to generate out of book 1 will make it reasonable for us to expect. So does that speak to your?
Thank
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a feeling, it seems to me that there is a presupposition of the question about how soul fits with the world. And this presupposition, I think it is that the world has been praised. So, has been praised by a soul, by intelligence like us, some sense. so that it makes sense to say that forms are already potentially in art, like were in God before, the world. But you didn't say anything about that.
No, well, as you were saying your question, I just made my mind interpret it. I suppose, there are two competing presuppositions. One would be that it's the other way around. That soul was created by the world. Here's a third presupposition, which I think is more Aristotle's, that they are coeval, that they are, but that they are, so to speak, parts of this. They are parts of one world, if you like, rather than you have the world, and then this alien, by which I mean really alien. And so I'm quite struck by this passage in Daniel 1:2, where he complains about his adversary. I mean, he's excited about it because he says, nous is unmixed and has nothing in common with any of the other beings. Aristotle thinks he's like the only one to go this way, and there's something right about it. But on the other hand, he leaves it unintelligible if it's unaffected by, unmixed with, has nothing in common with, has no affinity to. Why on earth should it know the beings which is its word? So I do think there's a presupposition that they are not, in that kind of strong sense, that soul and mind and world, soul and beings, they can't be alien to one another in that kind of sense. They have to have a koinonia. But now, whether that koinonia is a result that one produces the other, as on the presupposition you give me, or it's worked out in some other way, it seems to me that's left open. So I do think there is a presupposition lurking here, namely not just that it's a fact, but this is a fact that's intelligible. For Aristotle, that requires that there's some koinonia or syngeneia, there's some affinity or likeness or community that characterizes the players in this transaction, on the hypothesis that a transaction is intelligible. But whether it has to go as strong as you put it, I don't mean clearly Aristotle thinks nous is the arche of everything, but that's not at all clear. In fact, it's pretty seems not to be that he thinks it's the creator. Yeah, so I stay clear of that presupposition in a way unconsciously, but now that you put it to me explicitly, like I would want to hope to steer clear of it to the extent that I'm channeling Aristotle's problematic. And does that?
No, absolutely.
Thank you. I have a couple of thoughts.
Sí, sí, sí.
Sí, no. Yo no había visto. Yeah, what is you said at the beginning that it's not about like correcting his predecessors. I mean, they say that the soul is in a way the elements of all being.
Yeah.
But then he said he wanted to say no. That soul is all being. But in the end, he doesn't say, well, said that, but he means that soul is the form of all being, which is
The form of
yeah. And so, but that's like saying that is a principle of being. So it's not that, I mean, it's different because they say that the elements is the principle, but it's not that different, right? It's just let's say a version of the view that like causes like and like knows by like with some refinements.
So I want to say yes. And then the question becomes, what are the refinements and are they substantial enough for this to constitute an essential correction, or whether this is a friendly amendment? Yeah, I mean, that's the, and the questions, it's a bit vague, people will rule that differently, but the thing that I would be myself inclined to say, and this is picking up a little bit, something I was saying to Ricardo, is that for Aristotle, actually, the essential thing to say is that soul is form, where forms are norms, forms are standards, forms are measured, and that's the idea. So first, that's where I would locate the correction thing. I mean, in a way, the project began from the definition of soul. So we have all these complaints about the earlier guys, and then we're told soul is form. How does that now go back to book one? How does that clear things up? And it seems like it doesn't clear. And in a way, it can't clear anything up by itself because things are more complicated than the facts are more complicated. The facts that need explaining are more complicated than it really does. So, but still, there's something essential, I think, from Aristotle's perspective, that in the idea that soul is form, in his account of Isis's account of form. And it's true, he has to kind of pivot off form to Paideia if we're going to get now to the idea of at least one kind of loose as the willingness to see it where you go. But in a way, I want to see those as different applications of the root idea of soul as form, and that is not a friendly amendment for the kind of fundamental correction. So I don't know how I can possibly establish, but that's the right way to read it, but that's my initial response.
Okay, thanks. Paulo. And
so I have like a couple of questions that are quite related to the questions that were just asked. And one is regarding this idea of the soul taking the forms of forms in intellect and in perception. It's related to this. So in a way, the form of form, I would guess, let's call it in normal, correct, healthy perception or intellectual representation of reality, would be, in a certain sense, take the same form, according to Aristotle. And I was wondering if it's the form of a form involves some kind of isomorphism or correspondence in a strong sense, then maybe one way, if what do you think of one way of understanding him is to say that the form that the soul takes is numerically the same, of course, not in matter. If I'm perceiving a dog, the form of my perception of the dog is not in matter the same as the dog, but it's in a way numerically the same as a form of the correct form of a form. And in that sense, it is the same form, and my soul having this potential capacity to represent in intellect and perception all things as they are, then it can take all of these forms, and it's this sort of numerical identity. I'm not really getting here kind of in the issue of universals, but if there's some kind of, if that there's some role to be being played by that, by the forms being, even though they are forms of forms, and there's this material basis which is different, not sure how to put it in scholarly correct way, but then there's this sort of identity in which we can say very strongly, but I think follows from what you said, that the soul in a way, in that way, is all beings. And the second question is about this issue of norms that just came up, which is, since if the function or purpose of the soul is to be able to, let's say, represent correctly the world through intellect and through perception, and this is done by taking the forms of the world, of course, a function is something that it's a normative notion, it's something that our soul could fail to perform. And this goes back to the issue of the honor, right? So it looks like we have to have some capacities, right? Material capacities, I'm not sure if that's the way to put it, but that there must be also room for us to fail to represent the world as it is. And this notion of function seems very useful in that regard, right? So our soul is potentially all the forms, but that doesn't mean that when I perceive a dog, there's really a dog. Maybe it's an optical illusion or something like that. So maybe we could say that the function of perception, for instance, would be to take the form of what's perceived, and it's a function that may or may not be fulfilled. And this normativity kind of fits very well into the Aristotelian take on it. Well, those are my two questions, basically.
Little questions.
Yeah.
So let me think about the first one.
Yeah.
First, and so in the expression form of the forms,
Yeah.
I think it's important to separate, on the one hand, the forms that say in sense perception that we perceive or that we receive, somehow moved or affected by. Okay, that's in the expression, the form of the forms. That's the forms in the plural. And then there's a question of the form by virtue of which we do that. And that is going to be the form which the sense is, in which in general sensibility is. As I read the Aristotle's, I think this so far is so versatile, is that form is a logos, not just any logos, but specifically a mesotes. Not just any mesotes, but specifically mesotes of the contrarieties in the range of the sense in question. So that for me now sets up the frame of the question. But when we think about in terms of example, in the use of the sense of sight, and I'm thinking in particular in seeing things which are proprietary to the sense of sight, because I take it into account the nature of the sense is actually designed in the first instance to explain the perception of the proper sensibles. Quite a lot goes into common sensibles, incidental sensibles, and so on. So I take it that although in the case of the sense of sight, the form of the forms would be different colors. Some light, some dark, some very light, some just a little light, some very dark, some just a little dark, and light and dark being differentiate colors. There are the light ones and the dark ones, and the form in virtue of which the soul perceives or discriminates or is moved by, or affected by, or receives those forms is in every case the same. The form, which is the very nature of it. So, which form is what? Well, it's a kind of logos, specifically a kind of meaning of the contrariety like that. And that's going to go analogously for every sense modality. If we turn to intellect,
yeah.
Now we got to reshuffle the cards and deal with it because everything is so nice and controlled in the sensory basic way, but intellect, we've got to deal with a form which Panta Noe, Panta understands everything, understands the being of every being that any being be. Every essence, everything there is to be falls within its domain. Now we have to ask, well, what could be the form in virtue of which all of those beings are intelligent? Okay, so I'm going to set that as the question I would need to go into to answer the second part of your first question. I think to go into it now would be would take me a long time. But that just not by way of answering your question, but by showing you where I think I would have to travel in order to answer your question. Okay. Now, when we think about failures, and in particular, how they are explained. And, you know, I suppose there are failures which, so this is complicated, right? I mean, I suppose there could be some failures where the failure was an index of the fact that your thing was functioning properly. And there's some failures that are because things weren't functioning properly, or they weren't in an environment that you function. So Aristotle says, you know, people who are doing color work with fabric with thread by candlelight, the next morning, they messed it all up. Couldn't tell because the colors are all good.
Right.
Where Aristotle thinks there's 3 colors in the rainbow, but because some colors juxtaposed next to others look lighter, it looks like there's 5 figures. Okay, so the story of failures is going to be complicated because it's not immediately transparent whether that counting the colors of the rainbow is 5. That's there are. Is that because our senses of sight is working well? But there are, as it were, questions of theory, how many colors in the rainbow, which are more complicated than just the information delivered by. And now intellect comes in this. Okay, so there's a large set of questions about what, so to speak, failures of perceiving in the case of the proper sensibilities are due to failures of organisms. But when they are due to failures of the organism, they will have the same shape, in my view, which will be the form and virtue of which it's its job to perceive. Well, that form, the organ doesn't realize it because it's diseased or damaged or temporary. Of course, there's a lot that can happen between you and the interior here, so my eyes can dry out and get tired, or a speck of dust, and the lights could go. So not every misperception is, so to speak, layable at the door of the form of the primary sense organ, that is the failure of the sense organ to instantiate its form because it's damaged because the complexity of the process. You know, now the intellectual. Well, now it becomes even more complicated, right? Because in a way, our intelligence, you know, we need to learn before we are competent judges in any particular domain. So there could be a lack of proficiency, a lack of mastery, a lack of the relevant episteme or technique would be the source of. Or because they know we've got that, but there's some failure there. So you can see, again, I'm not answering your question, but exposing a little bit some of the complexities would be involved. Complexities which, given the generality of its discussion, it would be astonishing if the De Anima laid down quite simply the recipe that. So does that satisfy that failure to answer your question? Is that satisfying?
No, very, very illuminating. So and just a quick follow-up. So the issue of the essence, right, versus material constitution, like the example of Ricardo of the ornament, right? The essence cannot be, well, of course, sorry, like no scholar of Aristotle or ancient philosophy whatsoever, but it looks like the essence of the soul has to have this, be related to the purpose in a certain way that is not just even, there must be a gap between material constitution and the essence of the soul, so that there's a space for, you know, failures to be classified as this is supposed to do this, right? Like the orange is not supposed to be a hammer, but we do have something that is supposed to be a hammer but is cracked and doesn't work, right? And I was just thinking of what are the metaphysical underpinnings of that, but I don't know, I'm appreciate that, but it's very interesting.
That's good. I mean, and I think there is some vocabulary that Aristotle uses to mark, or which he interprets as marking, the failure of some other person to seize on the normative significance of forms. So he will say, well, they attribute things to the mixes, or the crassus. And he'll say things like, you know what, people call that 2K, chance or luck. They don't call it crucis. They don't call it logos. They don't call it. Okay, so there are kind of polemical contexts in which some vocabulary requires a kind of thematic charge by these sorts of contrasts, and that is useful when we see some treatment of predecessors in which that vocabulary recurs, but maybe without the surrounding drawn out and made explicit polemical context that makes immediately apparent what it is in the passage that Aristotle objects to strongly. But if we realize that words like mixus and crassus are like trigger words for him, then when we see those words occur in other contexts, we can conjecture quite only. Maybe this is what's so that's the way I would think of that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Paula?
Hello, Ken.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know whether your project includes somehow clarification of how Aristotle understands the link between body and the soul, because every time I read this this idea of the soul is like a hand. I reckon I understand that's the tool of these parts. I reckon I get that.
One step ahead of me.
So my doubt, my problem is there must be something else that puts the original tool to work. And I find the same issue with the other metaphor that you offered when you were explaining that the knowing is the proper function of the soul. And the metaphor you used was like the healing is the proper attribute of the art of healing. But there must be something else that decides to put that capacity to work. Except that in this case, it is so it up to here it sounds to me as though yes, I am using my capacities of knowing in virtue of something else. So I'm putting my soul to work in virtue of something else. But as it happens in this case, it is the soul itself that.
Can I ask just a clarificatory question? So just at the end you said, I am putting my soul to work in virtue of something else. And when you began your remarks, I thought you were wondering about the relationship of the I, which was putting your soul to work, and the soul which was being put to work. But by the end of your remarks, there was this third critter that came in, that in virtue of which I am putting my soul. So my clarificatory question is, which of the two do you want to hear more about? Because I think I would want to say different things about the two.
See, so no, the first one, so the relationship between the I and
Yes. Okay.
different bits of the I.
Yeah. So I think here I don't have much more to say than what's said in passage 5. I don't actually myself find that particularly troubling. So suppose watching with my daughter yesterday, the murder on the Orient Express. And they're stopped after the murder occurred. There's a big snow drift, the train can't move, and they want to get this cleared up before they get. But so the Poirot's been asked to solve the problem, and the first person is called in and he says, "And who are you? Where do you get off asking me these questions?" And he says, "Well, I'm Inspector Poirot, detective. I'm engaged by this guy who's the director of the line." And then the guy shuts up and asks questions. Yeah, so there's this here, Poirot assumed a certain role in interrogating. So tell me about yourself and who you are, and where you come from, and how you came to know the victim, And the person is questioning his right to put those questions to him. Why is it your job? And in answering that question, he gives a display of what? Some of his proficiencies and of his authority, because he's been. And that's satisfies. And I don't start now to wonder, yes, but the you who, in virtue of your proficiency at investigating, and you're having been appointed pro tem by the manager of the line to conduct this investigations, what's the relationship between the you and, as it were, the different hats that you wear that I'm appointed to? It doesn't feel to me anything in a way problematic. If I'm asking, so to speak, for the metaphysical subject of Poirot's behavior, I want to say it's Poirot. And here I feel like I'm channeling passage 5. And if I want to ask, oh, why? And if I'm hearing the question in the way I'm hearing Aristotle's question, that is to say, in virtue of what, is this his job? Is this his work or his function? Then it seems to me the appeal to his credentials or his competencies or so on is quite in order and not in a way that jeopardizes the idea that, after all, it's simply asking the questions. So I don't know if that's me playing dumb a little bit in response to your question by kind of saying, well, I don't see the problem. They just did it the other night in the movies, and nobody had a metaphysical meltdown. When it happened. So maybe it's me playing dumb, but in a way, I'm bringing that playing dumb to how I'm reading Aristotle as well. I mean, Aristotle in the De Anima, this is like a work of biology. It's not a work of how many angels can dance on head of the kind of thing. And that perspective informs a little bit how I read it. Does that make intelligible why I answer what I did?
It was complex. Oh, maybe it's just me that I'm trying to make it burn where Aristotle does not want it to be. But for instance, in your passage number 5, you decided to translate the dative with
Yes.
those great people. I mean, somehow I took that the mental as though I am choosing to do something with my soul.
Yes.
And some reason that sounds to me as a metaphysicism. I'm using this.
Good. So let me ask you, if I ask the question. So with which of the senses do you tell whether it's light or dark? Is it the sense of smell? Is it the sense of hearing? Is it some sense that's not any of the, is it one of the 5, or is it some other one, and so on? Because after all, whether it's light or dark, it was completely dark out. If the sense of sight is used for discriminating color, this doesn't seem to be the case of color. And I take it Aristotle will answer it's with the sense of sight. Opse, okay, so an instrumental dative. But I wonder, whether that use of the instrumental dative, or if I say of the builder, and how does he do it? What could Dominique, and I use the instrument. Do those uses of the instrumental data, in the case of the techne or in the case of a particular sense, cause you the same problem with the cup as in passage 5? So I want to read passage 5 like those, but for me, those don't create the problem. You might say, I want to read those like passage 5. This is the controlling one in passage 5. You know, so part of it is maybe you have the same reaction to both passages, or maybe you have a differential reaction. And then you know, I want to drag the one in the one direction, but maybe you want to drag the other and say, I have to be right, I'm just explaining. That's how I have to do it. I mean, I might be the one metaphysically obtuse, and I don't see the problem.
I'll have to give it a further pulse, but thank you.
Yes, just one more point on this. Do you think there's any that passage that animal doesn't, human being doesn't see? It's not the soul that thinks of this human being. You think that there's a relationship with that, and that famous passage in the PhD books where like the distinguishes between 184 key distinction. That with which we proceed using the dative, and that in virtuous window by means of which we are anything.
90,000%, yes. And the Bernier, well, that's obviously the data of a metaphysical subject that he's using in the thesis. This is to me just a complete disaster. That is just anchors. That's the literature. I think it's just this is just but that means reading that the way I read this, the way I read like the 3-2, I think is this. You know, with what sense do we perceive that? What perceive? That's the kind of question that opens up, and on the sort of question that you're raising, I interpret that as kind of harmless, and I interpret this as harmless, and I interpret that as harmless. But if we started with Bernier as no, the discovery of the subject of the then we bring that here, and then we bring, and then you can see how. Yeah, so I do want to read them together, but in my particular, that's fine.
Yeah, Ricardo.
Yeah, well, it's just a small point about the idea of schools being the form of forms. I think that one problem to make sense of this claim, and the other is to make sense of the analogy with the hand.
Yes.
Because how should you understand the analogy? It's for that when Aristotle said that hand is a tool for the tool.
Yes, there's another passage where it's pro. Right, yes, exactly.
I would say it's a genitive.
Here it's a genitive, yeah.
And the other one,
It's the preposition pro. So tool before things. Yeah, I don't have the passage at my fingertips, but it's in the biological books.
okay, fine. So the hand is a tool of tools in the sense that it's something that we use tools. And I use my hand to grab a hammer, or use my hand to grab a saw. But given that, how is that focused on and what a soul is? Is it the idea? I mean, is the point of the analogy that focus and as well, and that it is a tool in the sense that it's something that we use to perceive sensible form or intelligible form of other things. That's not how you were analyzing the notion itself of being a form of form.
That's correct.
Okay, so but in your interpretation, what's the meaning of analogy, which is very attractive but very obscure?
I agree, absolutely. So starting with the analogy. And starting with a vague, I suppose, and maybe this is partly because I'm thinking of the other passage, but maybe not. But the idea is there is some kind of priority of the hand to other tools. Is it that the hand makes the other tools? That the hand uses the other tools? Is it that the hand enters into the very idea of the other tools? For instance, that they are hand tools, you can't understand actually what they are and how they're designed except with reference to the hand. So those, I take those to be at least two, maybe three competing options. Whether it makes a tool that uses it, three different ways of spelling out a kind of priority. The tool of tools, the tool before all of it. And I take it that that priority needs now, in some substantial measure, to carry over to the soul as formal forms. Not necessarily the idea of tools, because that's on the hand side of the thing, but the idea of priority. Okay, so not that I know how to prove this, but my idea is that the soul is the measure of its objects. And there is in Aristotle priority of measure to measure. Yeah. And that's in a way substituting one metaphor for another, but maybe a metaphor that's closer to cognition, and therefore less metaphorical than the metaphor that its tools. So in the I take it that, you know, what is a measure? It's a kind of unit. And what's special about the unit is that the other quantities that it measures are defined by their relationship to that unit. So 1 cubit, or 1 mile. Now I measure 3 cubits or 6 cubits or 7. What it is to be those particular quantities is to stand in some relationship to, so to speak, the order quantity, the unit quantity, the measure, which has now a kind of priority over every quantity of which it's a measure. And I want to say analogously, now it's not so helpful to think of soul in general, to think of istasis, or nous, that there's some comparable sort of priority. If I understand the nature of each of those, and if I understand the nature now of the forms, which each of those is an instrument in the cognition. It is of which each of those is in a way measurable. And it's because our cognitive powers are measures of their objects, that it's their job to know those objects. And the idea is, what if we could reason from the nature of the objects to the nature of the measure of those, and thereby kind of follow the progress forward from object activity to power, and arrive at some conception of the nature. So for me, the metaphor of measurement, which I hear, although it's not there, I mean, it's vocabulary that's essentially absent. Passage, it's not relevant. But for me, I hear it in passage 13. This idea of canon, preface. So that's the vocabulary that I use now when we come back to your question. Well, what's the priority now of this to all these other things, which it is in some sense the form of that's what I mean. I think it has to be a hypothesis. I don't know how to, but that's the way.
Well, thanks a lot, Sean. We've run out of time. So I would like to thank Sean for this wonderful talk, a great discussion.
Thank you.